just the kind of thing you want.
Exactly. Did Scottdale Mill interact with other mills in any kind of way?
Oh, yes. There was a Georgia Textile Manufacturers Association, which was an association of virtually all the textile manufacturing companies in Georgia. And we met once a year at some nice resort, like in Florida, and would go over things of our mutual interest. And we would organize lobbying for our interest at the state capitol and at in Washington, and those things that were essential for the health of our industry. At one time, the United States sold cotton to internationals at 5 to 6 cents a pound less than they would let us buy it. So that gave us an uneven platform. Then later on, when other industries after the Second World War began to produce lots of textiles with brand new machinery that had been provided them by the United States aid to help them recover from the war, then they had more modern machinery than we did, and then they were competing back with us. The government giving them cheap cotton and low capital costs, put a quota system and only allowed so much textiles to be imported back into this country. So we were lobbying hard not to increase those amounts significantly, because you can't run a business without a market. And if your market is given to countries with low wages and you've only got a small fraction of profit, you can't survive. During my days at Scottdale, particularly in the 60s and 70s when I calculated it, of every dollar of sales we had, 40 cents was labor. The rest of it was raw material and overhead. And so we had 40% of our total costs were labor. And we were only making 2 to 3 cents per sales dollar. You can see how competitive it would be. Then there was also the American Textile Manufacturers Association, which the elected leaders of the Georgia Textile Manufacturers Association, the South Carolina Textile Manufacturers Association, the North Carolina, the Alabama, and so forth, and the cotton producers would all go to try to see that their interests were considered by the lawmakers. So yes, there was, and I could even, as a superintendent running a factory, from the people that I would meet at these conventions, if I was having trouble with a process in the plant, I could call up somebody I had met in these conventions, and they would let me come into their plant and learn how they had solved the problem. And likewise, we'd let them come in and solve the problem at our plant, because these workers in the plants that spend their lifetime there, some of them have amazing ideas. I'll just give one example. One idea that was, I can't say it was developed at Scottdale, but it was used there for over 40 years, ended up solving a problem in space exploration. When after the first man was on the moon, and they had these space suits that were pressurized because the air outside wasn't pressurized, they found that when a astronaut would bend its arms or knees, that these inflated tubes would collapse, and the collapsing would change the volume in the tube and increase the pressure on the air in the tube. They were trying to find a way that they could make a suit that would not collapse when you bend at the elbows or the knees. And they knew that you could knit a circle, but knitting doesn't make strong fabrics. They make flexible fabrics that'll bend all kinds of directions, and they needed the strength of weaving. And they said, well, there's no way to weave a circle. And they came down to the Texas school at Georgia Tech and talked with them, and they said, no, there's no way to weave a circle. But the superintendent of our plant happened to be visiting the textile school that time. No, he had an ex-superintendent that was working somewhere else went there, and he heard them talking, and he said, you can't weave a circle? And they said, no. So that's interesting. They said, why? He said, Scottdale Mills has been weaving circles for 40 years. So by this time, the technology was at the Georgia Duck and Cordage Mill. Scottdale had shut down. And so mechanics from Georgia Duck and Cordage Mill went to Georgia Tech's textile school and took one of their looms and set it up to weave a circle. And and that was, something that you wouldn't learn in school, but something that we were weaving a seed bag to where the edges were woven together, and then we could change the weave. We had a bicycle chain we could put this little bump in the bicycle chain, and every time it went by, it would change the weave and would weave the bottom together. So when we got through, you could just cut it off and you'd have a bag, turn it inside out, and you'd have a very strong bag for expensive seed like alfalfa and things of that nature. You would need it for corn or wheat, but these grass and hay seeds were very expensive. And so they would weave these tubes out of polyester, you know it by Dacron, and then they would put a mandrel in it with shaped and put some on it, and they would, under heat, they would form it into a ripple effect to where it looked like the tube coming out of the back of your dryer.
Okay.
The corrugated tube where you can bend that tube and it won't collapse. And they made then that into some of the uniforms. And I think they've come up with something different now, but back in the 70s and 80s, say the 80s and 90s, they were using the technology developed at Scottdale Mills to weave the joints in the astronauts' uniforms. But there were a lot of developed. Scottdale was the first company to ever figure out how to weave corduroy on a basic loom. Everybody said you had to have a real fancy loom to weave corduroy. And during the Depression, when we needed to weave corduroy, this Hansford Sams was going to Georgia Tech at the time, and he was working in the supply room, and they put him in a loom there, and he figured a way to weave corduroy, and corduroy basic corduroy was woven by that method all over the textile industry, and it was developed at Scottdale. So there's different. Another thing we could do, we could weave cloth double on a loom and unfold it and have cloth twice the width of the loom. And I remember we had a lot of business we gave to the Army to make these wide pieces of cloth to use on their targets. They would put this cloth on a target, paste a paper target on it, and people would shoot it, and they'd bring it down in a hole. They'd paste a patch on it and set it up and have a marker show where the bullet went through it. But that's the way the targets in the Army would work. I used it when I was in the Army.
Please describe the administrative structure at the mill, if you can.
The administrative structure at the mill, there was a president. And in our plant, the president under him had the executive vice president who had various duties. You would have the sales area, and we sold the plant with 2 or 3 people, and we were tremendous volumes, and we were selling big quantities. And then there would be a superintendent of the plant who would run the plant, and then under him would be a technical department, and then there would be the head of the weave room, head of the spinning room, head of the carding and opening room, and head of the cloth room, and then somebody buying cotton. And then there would be somebody running the office and the payroll and the bookwork, things like that. That's basically the structure of the mill.
Okay. And as far as the actual production workers, did they have different job titles, or were they just...
Oh, yeah. I mean, there would be lots of job titles. You want me to go through all of them?
Depends on how many there are.
I'll go through the basic ones.
Okay.
Okay, there would be opening room operators, picker operators, card hands, they call them, drawing hands, fly frame tenders, spinners, winders, warpers, slasher operators, that puts the starch on it, drawing in hands, weavers, battery fillers to put the little bobbins in that would go in the shuttles, dolphers to take the bobbins off the spinning frame, dolphers to take the cloth off of the looms, mechanics in each department, card grinders, spinning room mechanics, winder mechanics, loom mechanics, cloth inspectors, lift truck drivers, and lots more, but those are the basic ones.
Okay. And you mentioned that you worked at the mill as a youth. When you became vice president, did you ever participate in any production activities?
I was involved with the people all the time inside the plant, and I would plan the modernization programs. I just remember once that we had to do our modernization. The company had a policy there'd be no work on Sunday, sort of like Chick-fil-A, and it was rigid policy, only emergencies. And emergencies basically weren't permitted to happen. Mm-hmm. I think in 23 years we had 5 emergencies. Fires, floods, that kind of thing would be an emergency. But we had everything organized to get it done during the week and not be able to not shut the plant down. You knew you couldn't work on Sunday. You had to organize it almost like a military campaign that knew exactly what happens. Well, right at the day before one of these things was to begin, the crane operators went on strike. And so everybody said, well, we're not going to be able to lift these machines up on the top floor. Well, I said part of my job was I knew that I was a problem solver. So I went up Ponce de Leon to a contractor's equipment place and looked around. They had these new cranes that were hydraulic operated with these little levers rather than these cable cranes. And I said, how long did it take you to teach me how to operate that crane? They said, about 20 minutes. I said, get on it. And so they showed me how to operate this crane, and I called back and told the head of the mechanical department that were going to start changing equipment. I said, get your people ready. We're going to lift them up. He says, how are you going to do it? I said, get ready. You'll find out when I get there. So I drove this crane down Ponce de Leon, having only been on it for 20 minutes, and pulled up there and put out the outriggers and told to hook up the tag lines to the first machine, and I lifted it up into the second floor. And by this time, the master mechanic looked at it and he said, get out from there, Mr. Scott, and let me do it. So then he did it, and we kept on schedule.
Okay.
And there was another situation where this is not exactly the worker level, but I remember one time when we were putting in some new equipment that didn't work, that I worked 3 days in a row, 24 hours a day, because I was about dead. But then another time, I was executive vice president, and there was a superintendent under me, and the weave room was having major trouble, mostly related to labor problems. And the superintendent had fired about 5 different weave room heads. But you can fire somebody, and if you can't bring in somebody better, you just make it worse, and it got worse and worse. And finally, the president of the company called me in. He said, would you be willing to set aside being executive vice president and go in under the superintendent and see if you can turn the weave room around? I said, under one condition. He said, what? I said, you keep the superintendent who hasn't done the job off of my back. Let me work for you, and I'll go in, report in at 6:45, 7 o'clock in the morning, and work the 12-hour shifts that it will take. And standard production is measured in a weave room as to how many times the shuttle crosses all the looms. And somewhere around 90-92% of the absolute maximum is what you're expected to get. That number, and the shuttle crossings are measured in thousands. And a pick is 1,000 shuttle crossings. We were supposed to have 82,000 picks a day. When I went in there, it was around 46, almost 50. A lot of that was because of absenteeism. When the plant doesn't run, people are so discouraged they won't come to work. And so there would be a lot of equipment standing, but what was there was low quality and low production. And I'd never run a weave room, and I was frightened. I didn't know whether I could succeed or not. But, and I told you working people was not my strong suit. I had learned my people skills in the Army and in the Rangers. And it takes a little bit different approach in a factory. But I could solve problems, and so this was a major problem. So I went in and got the 3 overseers that ran the 3 shifts. And I said, I've been sent in here by the president of the company to turn this room around. I said, do you all know what has to happen to turn the room around? I said, how long have you been in a weave room? 30 years, 25 years, 15 years. I said, do you all know what has to change to turn it around? And they said, yes. They had to say yes, that's their profession. I said, well, I don't. And I said, this is the way we're going to do it. The 3 of you are going to decide what has to happen and in which sequence. You all say, this has to happen, this has to happen, and this has to happen. I'm going to make it happen. But you're going to control what we do. But I'm going to make it happen. Well, they didn't pick up right off. I was going to make it happen through them. But I was in there for something around a half a year. And when I came out, the pigs had gone from 46,000 pigs to 78,000. And I wanted to stay until I'd gotten them to 82,000, but the superintendent above me was getting edgy, and he wanted to get me out to where he could go back and be responsible for everything.
Right.
But I learned something about managing people, and I learned it right out of the Bible. Jesus said, if you are to be great, you've got to be a servant. And the one that will be the greatest will be the servant of all. And he talked about servant leadership. And I'd never been into that before. I was going through the Army and all, I was in the boss category. So I told them, I said, we're going to change our leadership style. I said, who's the most important employee in this weave room? To these three supervisors. They didn't know what to say. They said, is it him? Is it us? We better not say. So they said, we don't know. I said, you've been here all these years and you don't know who's the most important employee here? I said, I know who the most important employee is. They said, who? I said, it's whoever makes the product that we can invoice and sell, convert into money to pay everybody else, and the electric bill, which was about $1 million. It was the 5th largest consumer of electricity in DeKalb County at the time. And I said, that's the weaver. And I said, each of us and every other employee in the weave room is here to serve the weaver. And if we serve the weaver well, we'll be successful. And if we don't serve the weaver, we won't be successful. And so I reconstructed all my concepts of management to take 350 people and get them from fighting with each other and blaming each other. What's wrong? It's their fault. And to how can we serve the weaver to where her job is easier and that she can make more and better fabric that we can sell. And that's a long story, but it's probably the most significant experience in my 41 years in managing factories. But it was successful. Oh, and one other thing. There was only one employee fired in that 6 or 7 months.
That's impressive. As far as interacting with the workers, did you maintain a formal relationship with them, or were you sometimes informal?
Mostly informal.
Mostly informal.
I never wore a tie. And I never asked a man to do any work that I wasn't willing to do myself.
And did you or your family develop friendships with the workers?
Some of them. I was, when I got there, people weren't living in the village so much, but they were, some of them traveling from 40 miles away. But I knew, when I was working inside the plant, I knew the names of most of them, knew what was going on in their families, I wouldn't say, I was working 10 to 12 hours a day and 6 days a week and involved in my church on Sunday. And during the time that I was superintendent, I wasn't married. I didn't get married till later. So we were on first name basis, but as far as a lot of social activities, not a lot.
Okay, and the friendships that you did develop, did they continue after the mill closed?
Yeah.
Okay. What is your perception of life at the mill for employees?
most people were working to get a paycheck that would clear the bank, and that there weren't any rainy days. Not like roofing or construction or something like that. The wages were not on the high end, but if you knew you were going to have 51 weeks of work a year and frequently overtime when you needed extra money, because if you work 24 hours a day and somebody's absent, you've either got to hire extra people or have people to work over, and you don't know what skills you're going to need, so most of the time somebody gets to double over either 8 hours or 2 people 4 hours. Somebody come stay over 4 hours, somebody come in early 4 hours. And many of them became good friends, and but it was hard work, and some of it was dirty work, but a lot of work is dirty. And some of the people, when we shut the plant down, many of them missed it, and some of them didn't. But I would say that when the processes ran smoothly, they enjoyed being at work. But all processes don't always run smoothly, particularly when you have a product like cotton that varies like it does. And but the biggest difficulties that people had is when, for whatever reason, the threads broke too much or the machinery broke down too much. When things didn't run well, people didn't like coming to work.
That makes sense. And how would you characterize life for you at the mill?
Well, I found that, I wanted to do work that I could do exceptional work with less than average effort, as opposed to do less than to do less than average work at more than average effort.
Right.
And I found that I had the abilities to deal with the kind of problems there were in the plant. Some of the things that would make a good manager I didn't have, and I eventually learned that. I always thought I'd be chief executive officer someday, and about 20 years into it, I realized I didn't have those gifts, that I had the gifts for a number 2, and that I could make any number 1 better of being his number 2, but I didn't have the gifts to be a number 1.
Were benefits available to employees outside of their salaries and the housing?
You know, that kind of thing progresses when you go back to the early days when I wasn't there. I can't speak to it. I know when I went there, we had medical insurance, but there was no such thing as major medical. And when someone would have a major operation, which in those days didn't cost an arm and a leg like it does today, what would happen is the people would ask the company for help. And we would say, get people in different departments to take up a collection, and whatever you collect, we'll match. So if it was a minor operation, they'd take up a less amount. If it was cancer, some major operation, they would take up more. And whatever the employees did, we would at least match. And that was sort of we had basic, but if it went beyond, but in those days, it wasn't whatever your expenses are, we'll pay so much per day in the hospital and so much for this or that, so that our costs were controlled.
Right.
And then later on, wise or unwise, we put in a major medical health plan, and that helped eventually break the company. I saw the day when our health insurance costs far exceeded our profits, but we didn't stop it. In 1965, we put in a retirement program based on a 401k, and we matched the employees' money at a certain percent up to a certain percent, and they could put in the rest. And I remember putting in that program, and we met with groups of 20 or 30. I was attending meetings in the middle of the night and all the time through that to present this plan to get people, because they had to voluntarily put their own money in it. And we got a computer program that could access the payroll data and would calculate what would happen if you did 2%, 4%, 6%, on up to 15% of your pay, got the advantage of not having to pay taxes on it. In other words, the government put in some to do not getting the taxes. And then if the stock market, if the investment program did this percent of that percent of that, this is what you'd have at age 65. So if the person was 55, there wouldn't be much. But if a person was 28, would be different. And then it came up that if a person put in 10%, it was like 10%. What I remember the dollars better. An average employee, if they put in $30, which I think was $300 a week, yeah, about 10%, it would cost them $20 because the government would put in the other 10 from those taxes. And we were currently making 9.5% on the investments that they invested. We had professional people doing it. At that time, we were making 9.5%. I remember taking 10% and saying, I figured if you were below 30 and put in that $30 a week, when you were 65, you would have $750,000. And then the company had a profit sharing plan in addition to that, which at that time was putting in about a third of what that was, so that would be another that'd be $1 million. So what it amounted to, if an employee would change their lifestyle and live off of $20 less a week and do it until they were 65, and if we could continue making that 9.5% to 10% on the investment portfolio, they'd have $1 million. So the way I presented it was, I had this program to print out a sheet for everybody with their name on it and their actual data out of the payroll records showing what they earned, calculated all these different ways. And so when they would come in, we would hand them this sheet, and they would be groggy from working all night or working the evening or something, and another one of these darn meetings that management's doing, and they'd lay their heads down on the desk, and they were not interested at all. And I have an overhead projector, and I would look around for about a 28-year-old or something, 27, 28-year-old. And I said, Ronnie, let me have your sheet. He said, what do you want to do with it? I said, I want to use it to illustrate my talk. Well, he didn't want people to know his personal information. And he'd look at me, and he said, what do you want mine for? I said, well, Ronnie, I just want to show these people out here how you can become a millionaire. What you talking about? I said, yeah, I want to show them how you can become a millionaire. All these heads start coming, these sleepy heads start coming up off of the lunchroom counter. And he said, you serious? I said, Ronnie, I'm dead serious. Out comes the paper. And I put it on there, and of course it's blurred on the screen, and people don't have their glasses on or something. And I said, Ronnie, if you were to put, if you change your lifestyle and lived off of $20 less a week and invested it in this program, and we were able to get the returns that we've been getting for the last 5 years, that's how much you would have when you retired. $7,500? And then everybody's looking at it. $75,000? And then somebody up there says, hey, that's $750,000. And they looked at me, is that right? I said, $750,000. I said, Ronnie, I lied to you. You won't be a millionaire. You'll just be 3/4 of a millionaire. However, the profit sharing plan, if we were able to make profits, we would add another $250,000. You would have $1 million. And I said, you can put more money in there if you want to. Oh, before I said that, to get them all awake, I said, well, Ronnie, I told you I was going to tell them how you become a millionaire. I said, I got 4 ways you can become a millionaire. And they're all interested now. Nobody's sleepy anymore. I said, you can win the Reader's Digest sweepstakes, and you'll be a millionaire. Haw, haw, haw. I said, well, there's another way. I said, you can win the lottery, and you'll be a millionaire. Haw, haw, haw. And I said, there's another way, Ronnie. He said, what's that? I said, you can marry a millionaire. And then everybody, yeah, marry, oh, and they all went on. And then I said, now there's a 4th way. And I said, what it is? I said, see this sheet up here? See down there? I said, what does it say? It says name. I said, can you sign your name there? He said, yeah. I said, what's that next thing? It says percent. I said, if you put 10% in there, 10% of your wage, which was going to be $30 a week. Then I showed him that it would be $750,000. And he says, I can't hardly live off what I got now. Ain't no way I can live off $20 less a week. A bunch of the others said the same thing. I said, okay, you know what we've done? We've narrowed this discussion down to one issue. It's not whether you could become a millionaire. It's whether you can change your lifestyle. And I said, now here's a blackboard or a chart with a paper on it. I said, $20. I wrote $20 up there. I said, how can you change your lifestyle that would save that? And everybody looked at me thinking, I said, Ronnie, do you smoke? He said, yeah. I said, how many cartons a week do you smoke? He said, 1.5. I said, what does a carton cost? He said, $10. Now it's 30 or 40. He says, $10. I said, well, Ronnie, if you quit smoking, you could save $15, and now we're only looking for $5. And I said, could you cut back on your beer? $5 worth a week. He said, Mr. Scott, I can't cut back on the smoking. He says, ain't no way. I've tried before, but ain't no way I could cut back on. I can quit smoking. I said, well, Ronnie, that's no problem. He said, what do you mean it's no problem? I said, if you don't quit smoking, you ain't going to need a retirement.
Nice.
And everybody laughed, but they got the point.
Right.
And then we went into other ways. What if you were to go from $50 deductible to $500 deductible on your automobile policy? What would that save? What if you started bringing your lunch instead of going through whatever you're going through per lunch? And they figured they could save $2 or $3 a day. So if it's $3 a day, that's $15 or $10 a week. And I said, you see, we're not. I said, to save $1 million is not the issue. The issue is, will you change your lifestyle to save some of what you're earning and live off of less. Well, at any rate, later on, the people that put the consultants that put these things in came and told me, he said, twice the percentage of your employees are contributing to their 401k than any other factory we're dealing with. So it was just the method that we presented it in a way to wake them up and to show them the hard facts. And then I could go on to say, I had a African-American fellow that shouldn't have been working the mill. He had musical ability, but he couldn't make a living at it, and he ended up cutting the grass and hauling the trash from around different places, way below his ability. But he comes in one day virtually crying. He says, I've been renting a house for $315 a week, and he said, my daughter's got brain cancer, another daughter's had something about as bad, and his wife was sick, and he said, they've notified me they're going to sell the house. I have to vacate by a certain time. Somebody's going to fix it up and rent it for $600 a month. I can't remember. But he says, what's going to happen to me? And, I felt sorry for him. I sat there, I'm a problem solver. And I said, Roscoe, you got a 401k account? He said, yeah. I said, how much you got in it? I don't know. So I called the personnel department. They told me he had $12,000, which meant he could borrow $6,000. I said, why don't you buy a house? Can't buy a house. I've never bought a house. I don't think about buying a house. Who would sell me a house? I said, go and look around the neighborhood and see if you can find a house similar to what you're accustomed to living at, and see what it would cost to buy the house. So he left. I had got him out of my office because I felt sorry for him. And I called up a bank. And I said, I want to speak to your person, head of your real estate department, your mortgage department. And I said, I got this fella. They said, what kind of credit he's got? I don't know. But I said, I'm sure if you got all his utility bills, you'd find it was sorry credit. He doesn't manage too well. But I said, he's got a steady check, and he's got a 401k account. They said, well, no bank in Atlanta wants to loan to somebody like that. So we've got a consortium. All the banks have gone together. I'd never heard of this before in my life, and I probably you never had either. So we have a consortium in Atlanta, and every one of us that have somebody like this with bad credit but has a steady income, there's only one man in Atlanta that he can borrow from, and we all back him. If he says loan it, we loan it. So I said, I want his name and telephone number. So they gave his name, and I called him up. And finally, when I got him, he'd come back and told me what he could buy the house for, $40,000 or something like that. I've forgotten what it was. And I asked this man, what kind of a down payment would it take, and what would his notes be with his escrow? And he figured it up, and it came to $315 a month. And he needed $2,000 down or something like that. We had $6,000 he could borrow. So he came in, and I said, you can buy that house. He said, how? I said, because of your 401k account. I said, you can borrow to buy a house, but then you'll have to pay back that debt by taking more out of your thing. And he said, what's it going to cost me a month? And I told him. Really? He couldn't believe it. So, long story short, he buys the house and moves in. Of course, he comes praising me. I said, look, don't praise me. I said, you made a decision some years ago, and because you made a decision to save money, you can solve your own problem. I didn't do it. Sure, I found the answer for you. We worked together. So about 3 months later, he comes back crying again, and he says, the pipes in the house are no good. They're all bursting. I don't know whether it was that blue plastic that was no good or whether froze in the cold weather. I said, what did it cost to fix it? A plumber said $1,800. So I said, well, take the $1,800. You can borrow $6,000. You borrowed $2,000. There's another $1,800. So he did it and fixed it. And he was still working there, living in that house when the company sold in '98. So we had that. We had 1 week vacation. At the end of 5 years, I got 2 weeks vacation. At the end of 15 years, you got 3, and that held for me as well as them. I worked there, but I hardly ever took the 2 weeks. Because the vacation week when the whole plant shut down we did maintenance that we couldn't do with the plant running. So until I got married, I really didn't have any social life much. I never dated. I'd go work at a camp or something for a week and that'd be it. I took boys out cave exploring and mountain climbing and things like that. Today they'd probably investigate me for molesting boys or something.
I would hope not, but you're right.
I never thought about it back then.
No one did.
One of my cave exploring guys that I went out a lot with was John Pruitt of Channel 2.
Oh, really?
Yeah. When he was a kid. John Pruitt and I entered a place in a cave 1.5 miles under a mountain that we know we're the first 2 persons in the history of the creation of the world to enter. I told that story like that with him once, and he said, "You were second." I was 1 step behind him.
Wow, that's
but
a great
anyhow,
story.
it was we did pioneer exploring. I had my ranger background, and these guys were good.
Oh, okay.
Most of them were Eagle Scouts, and they graduated from Eagle Scouts, and what are they going to do next? But did that, and then I was called on by the State Patrol once on a cave rescue and found 3 boys that had been lost for 3 days. I was the one that found them, and that's sort of one of the highlights. But it was a 10-year period back there, but when I started working and when I got married, then I did most of that wild stuff. Although at 76, last week, I took my 14-year-old grandson on 40 zip lines and 25 cable bridges. So I ain't lost it all.
Oh, so you participated in that?
I went with him on every one of them.
Wow. That's impressive for me. And I'm only in my 30s.
There's a place in Banning Mills, south of Douglasville and Carrollton, that's got a real professional top flight situation and they told me they'd had a 90-year-old go through some of their zip lines.
Oh, that's impressive.
They said, though, that they're extreme zip lines, that I was the oldest person that ever gone through them.
Okay. Well, congratulations. I've been in the healthcare field for quite a few years, and I've come across many people who worked in not necessarily just textile mills, but many different mills that are developing respiratory illnesses. Was there a high incidence of respiratory illness at the mill?
Okay, you're asking about bisonosis. Bisonosis got its name coming out of the coal fields where they had black lung, which they called something osis. I've forgotten what they called it. Everybody said that you got bisonosis from working a textile mill. Well, we had a textile mill that ran on lower grade cotton, which meant the dust levels were higher. And if you had a problem, we should have had it worse. Well, the government said that 35% of our people would have bisonosis after a certain period of time. Well, the government's talking about lawsuits and medical expenditures, and of course, we were very concerned about the lawsuits as well as the effect on people. And we, like all the other textile mills, and in conjunction with working with them through this Georgia Textile Association, we're interested in looking into it. Then the government passed these OSHA laws that said we had to filter the air to get down to such and such a particulate coming out of the air. Well, our industry spent $2 billion trying to meet these requirements, and I worked my tail off trying to meet those requirements, and I couldn't. And we did lots of things to filter the air. And I'd done lots of things to filter the air before they ever passed the OSHA thing. And in fact, some of the men in the opening room, I remember when I set this thing up, before I'd been there 2 years, I went in there and I couldn't stand it. And I figured out how I thought I could get the dust out of the air. It was boiling out of the machines where they would open the cotton and blend it. And the machines were kind of enclosed, and I figured I could seal the machines and put pipes out the back and put a negative pressure inside the machine and make the machines leak in. Mm-hmm. And then take those pipes and run them through a filter. And I got approval to spend the money and spend it up. And the day I turned it on, I stood there with the workers who lived in there, and we watched as from the floor the air cleared. And we could just see it till it finally passed our heads to where you could hardly see across the room from the dust, to where it just looked clean.
Wow.
And they said that. Anyway, I had these machines, did all I could in the rooms that were the worst problem, and there was no way on earth I could meet it. And frustrated, I took the equipment out in the parking lot, way away from the mill. I couldn't meet it out there either. So it was ridiculous.
Right.
Standard put together by these long-haired Ivy League lawyers coming out and writing rules for Washington. Mm-hmm. But still, what was bisonosis? So the textile people had a big convention in Greenville, South Carolina that I went to. And we got the government medical people, the doctors, they could make their presentation, that we could ask questions. And our questions was, after they made their presentation, how, at our level, how can we diagnose bisonosis and tell if we have the problem? I said, how do you diagnose the problem? I heard this with my own ears. And his answer was, well, we see if you've got bronchitis. And he went down through all of the various lung diseases. And if you don't have any of those, we deduce that if you've got a lung problem, then you've got bisonosis. Mm-hmm. Now, how would you like to be in our position when told that?
Right.
And so we resisted full testing of all employees for reasons that it would be the end of us. Particularly if our competitors didn't do it. And finally, the government passed a law and dictated that every one of us had to do a test in-house to determine everybody that had any compromised lung function. And then the people we identified with any compromised lung function, we had to send them to professional people to analysis. We sent ours to the Emory Lung Clinic. We had 650 employees, and the Emory Lung Clinic, the head of the Emory Lung Clinic told me after examining everybody that had any dysfunction that we had 2 bisonotics in the plant, both of them reversible.